Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. From working as Manly P. Hall's research assistant and substitute lecturer to producing award-winning documentaries, music and books on mystical traditions, metaphysical countercultures, and Rosicrucian origins, author, musician, documentary producer, and self-confessed cat butler, Ronnie Pontiac has had a fascinating life, as we're about to discover when he shares the 10 books that influenced him the most on his life journey. Ronnie Pontiac, welcome.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me here, Sandie.
Well, this is one very erudite list that you've given us, Ronnie, and it really is intimidating because I am not sure I know any of these books except one. So that's quite a challenge for me. But I shouldn't be surprised when you've had Manly P. Hall as a mentor. That must have been an incredible experience.
It was 7 years of amazing blessings and turned me from a savage into a civilized human being.
Did you appreciate it when you were going through it as much as you probably appreciate it looking back now?
I did. I really did. Yeah, every moment was precious to me.
Good. Well, tell us first what books mean to you. What's your relationship with books always been like?
Well, in first grade, I had a teacher who gave me the best description of books that I think I've ever heard, which was that they are windows on other people's lives. It's like being able to live another life. And ever since I heard that, and even the way she pronounced books, she had this relish to it that stuck with me somehow. I've been very fortunate in my life to meet many book lovers, including Manly Hall, and to benefit from that love of books. And so in the beginning, when I worked for him, I had access to books that were almost impossible to find. Today, most of those books are available online. So we live in a world where we have this rich heritage available to all of us. And it's pretty thrilling. It's something that, books are your friends. They can completely change your life. And they can lie to you and teach you lessons that way. They are really wonderful companions.
They are indeed. And there's certainly, I love what she said. I've never heard it articulated that way. But yes, because when we're reading a book, we become the hero or the heroine. We try their life on for size and we can leave it at the end.
It's a wonderful metaphor for reincarnation, isn't it?
Isn't it just? Yeah, absolutely. So what was it like for you to have to, cull your list down to just 10?
That was very difficult. There were many contemporary books. My list leans toward older books, and especially toward great antiquities like Plotinus and the Flower Adornment Sutra. So I wanted to give everyone those because I knew that the modern books were out there being promoted for the most part. And I was trying to pick books that might not be available in your stream on a regular basis.
I'm glad you did. I'm really glad you did. We need to know about these and we don't get enough of them. Well, let's start with book 1, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy, better known as The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And this was published in 1928, I believe.
Correct. Yes, an incredible masterpiece, one of the centerpieces of Western Esotericism, and certainly one of the dominant works of occultism in the 20th century. an absolutely amazing look at the history of esotericism in the West. Essentially, this man traveled into Europe and gathered up these libraries that had all been set free by World War I. And all these materials were available very cheap because people weren't very idealistic at that point. He brought these treasures back and was moved by the desire to share them because nobody could see the wisdom that these people had gathered together, and sometimes risking their lives to do so. And he put them into this giant tome filled with illustrations, I mean, gorgeous illustrations drawn from the whole history that these manuscripts represent. And putting them together into these chapters that kind of give you a step-by-step look, going all the way back into Atlantis mythology, and then coming up through the stages through Rosicrucianism, and looking at almost every single aspect of the Western experience of esotericism. It's just a brilliant book, very eloquent. And one of the most exciting things to me about it was just the dedication, which is to the rational soul of the world, and gives us this completely different relationship with the world than we are usually taught to have. It's no longer a place of chaos. It's now a place where we learn and where we are guided and we learn to be rational. So it's a wonderful inspiration to artists. If you can't really read the dense writing in there, a lot of people have trouble with it. The illustrations alone are each like a meditation, and they're thrilling in the imagination and the talent that is shown in the artwork. So it's just an endless source of inspiration, and it has been in print ever since 1928, never fell out of print, with over at least 1 million copies sold over the years.
And it is frequently mentioned in people's 10 best lists.
Yes. It seems like a book that people always find along the path.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Wow, what a great title.
Isn't it?
I mean, I don't think you'd come up with a better one.
You know, he was going to try to do, when I was working with him, he wanted to do one for Eastern traditions, the same kind of book, but he didn't really live long enough. And also the new research, there was so much of it that he couldn't really keep up with it. But it would have been great.
Was he the most important mentor in your life?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. You credit him with helping you become who you are?
Yeah, I mean, the two people, my wife, who taught me to be honest and taught me about love and got me out of being the angry, nihilistic criminal that I was when she met me. And then he opened up this world of knowledge. He had this incredible thirst for knowledge. He found every culture, every tradition of spirituality and art and literature to be fascinating and filled with wisdom. And he was always seeking these truths that could be found in all of them, often the same truths. So that was very inspiring to me. And to see also how he worked. This was a man who in his 80s would be working on a book or two and articles for a journal and a lecture and answering correspondence and keeping the business going. It was just brilliant. So yeah, huge inspiration. And his kindness and generosity changed my life completely. He was a great friend.
Oh, that's lovely to hear, because we know of the teacher, we know of the author. We do not know a huge amount about the man, not as somebody who has shared part of his life, as you
I
have.
recommend, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I recommend a book by Tamra Lucid about that called Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, which is about our friendship with him through her eyes. She was a really big pal of his. They were close, and she was lucky to have a perspective that was even different than mine, because I was his assistant. There was a certain formality, although he was very kind and informal with me. But with her, it was something else. They were always laughing together, and it's a wonderful image of who he was in the 1980s, near the end of his life. This wonderful, humorous, lighthearted person, and synchronicities abounding around him wherever he went and whatever he did.
Well, you're going to have to help me out as we go along, because there are a few names here that are not necessarily easy to pronounce. And as a Brit, you know, I'm already in trouble because we pronounce words differently than Americans do. So the Flower Ornament Scripture, a translation of the You say the word?
Avalokiteshvara. Wait a minute, it's not Avalokiteshvara.
Avatamsaka?
I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry. I don't know.
You don't.
I'm not sure about how to pronounce it either. But if you give me just a moment, I
Well,
will find it.
phonetically, it's Avatamsaka, I think.
That's correct.
Sutra.
Avatamsaka. That's the
Okay,
correct.
by
Yeah.
Thomas Cleary, and that was
Yes.
published in 1993.
Yes. This is a wonderful scripture of Mahayana Buddhism coming from the Huayan school. It dates to, it probably was first begun about 200 years before the birth of Jesus. And then it's developed over hundreds of years until it reaches something like the form we have in China in around 600. And this is, it's so beautiful because the translation is like 1,600 pages. And it gives you this vision of the universe as you see it if you're enlightened. So there are Buddhas everywhere. There are infinite galaxies, infinite Buddhas, and these Buddhas are streaming light down onto all the universes to enlighten all the beings. And we're told the names and given the qualities, and it's all done in this beautiful poetic fashion. And at the heart of it is the idea that everything in existence is reflected in everything in existence. So we talk about the jewel net of Indra, and the description is that everything in the universe is this giant net of jewels. And in every jewel, every other jewel is reflected. And the last step is, but there are no jewels, only reflections. The meditation in itself. So the book is filled with these kinds of meditations. I've recommended it to people facing terrible situations, situations involving death or grave illness and such. And it's never failed to provide tremendous comfort because it gives you the sense that there's infinity ahead of you, there's eternity ahead of you, and there's an infinite number of Buddhas that are waiting to enlighten and are actively enlightening the universes now. And when seen from this perspective of enlightenment, the universe is incredibly, unspeakably beautiful.
Did all of these books on your list, come to you through Manly P. Hall, or are they others, some did and others you've kind of naturally progressed to along the way?
Some did. I would say that there was usually a connection of some sort. So, for example, in this case, he did not recommend this book to me. In fact, it was not out at the time that I knew him. He was very interested, however, in Huayan Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and he was studying, when I worked with him, Shingon Buddhism. The great Shingon teacher Kukai, the founder of that Japanese school, which was a distant ancestor of this. And this sutra was at the heart of Kukai's teaching, one of the main sutras. And so through my interest in Kukai, when this came out, I encountered it. And it was like finally getting to read one of these scriptures that was so influential to this great teacher. One of the things I loved about Kukai was he had this saying, which was, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old. Seek what they sought." And I always thought that was so liberating. And
Yeah.
so, yes, he did influence me definitely in the sense that he set me on all these paths. But a lot of these books were not books I ran into when I was there.
Well, book number 3, The I Ching, or the Book of Changes, translated by Richard Wilhelm and Carey F. Baines, published in 1952. There are so many different translations of this. What drew you to this one in particular?
I recommended this one. It's not the greatest translation, but it's fairly solid. And it has interesting supportive material for those who want to know about the history and context and have a better understanding. It's a good place to start. But I do recommend to people to get all the different translations and look at the various websites that offer translations online, because it helps you to get a better understanding of what's really being said. We tend to turn things, especially American translators and writers, really Americanize material. And sometimes I'm shocked by what the translations are of the lines, for example, because they're so outside the Chinese mentality of the time that the I Ching was written. But having said that, now this was a book that I encountered myself because a psychic, somebody that was recommended to me by Stephen Ross, this amazing psychic Edward A. Monroe, said, you have some history with this oracle and you need to check it out. And the funny thing was, I have to tell you that my first few months of relationship with it, it was often thrown against the wall because I was so angry about what it told me. But now it's the most cherished experiment. I think that and astrology are experiments for me that have been lifelong. And I've kept careful records. And I have to tell you that this thing, it's incredible. It not only will it pick out specific things in what you're asking so that you recognize that it understood the question, but it has also gotten me out of so many messes of so many different kinds by giving me the most subtle and sometimes unexpected advice. And it also will, I've noticed, put me into a mess so that I will avoid a bigger mess. And so it's a great experiment. I've enjoyed it greatly, and I highly recommend to anyone interested in this. It presents itself as a sage, and the intent is not to make you dependent on it, but to teach you to recognize the rhythms of life, to know when to move forward and when to be silent, to understand the positive and negative of life, and to learn to dance with life by intuiting those changes.
Mm. Book number 4, an undisputed classic in the field of psychic exploration, The Unobstructed Universe by Stuart Edward White, published in 1940.
This was one that also came through that same psychic, actually. And Tamra had the book recommended to her, and she couldn't understand it very well when she read it because it's a slightly dated form of English from the 1930s, and it's a little complex. She asked me to translate it for her. I've actually have a book that's almost done now called The Unobstructed Way, at least for now, that is all about them, their lives, and their teachings, because they are, to me, one of the most fascinating examples of American metaphysical religion, and one of the most successful experiments ever conducted in connection with the afterlife. And who they were and the teachings that they produced are, to me, dramatically above most of what we find in psychic literature. And we have somebody in his case who was a lifelong writer of westerns and frontier novels based on his experiences as a miner, a lumberjack, as all these things, and a great outdoorsman who has a California trout named after him and a grove of redwoods named after him, and was described by his friend Teddy Roosevelt as the greatest shot that he ever met. And this fellow turned into a guy who didn't shoot animals anymore after filling up a huge building with the animals he'd shot in Africa and other places. The influence of his wife made him into a photographer instead. And when they happened upon a Ouija board, they were led into her mediumship. But this was not mediumship about lost relatives or health or reincarnation. This was about where we are, why we're here, where we go, how the unobstructed universe where we come from is the same as the obstructed, except that in the obstructed, in our bodies, we're at a very low frequency, and that this world is like our laboratory. It's a place that we come to try things out, excuse me, to learn, to find the divinity within ourselves, and to find that light, and that this world is a excuse me, is a great experiment and creativity, a kind of artistic project in which we all get involved. She says at one point that Betty is the medium's name, his wife, and Betty says at one point that that when you get on the other side, that your biggest urge is to do something to make it better down here. And that's why we come here, not just to learn, but also to improve this world and to make it a better school and to make it reflect the true, incredible dimensions and horizons that are available to human beings once we open the spiritual dimension of our lives. So they have some wonderful teaching that they give you exercises as well so that you can have these experiences yourself. And one of the things that's amazing to me about them, besides their great love story, and the way that love story continued after death, was that Carl Jung's interest in them. And Carl Jung actually admitted in a letter to one of his friends that he thought that Betty had survived death, that she was not only an archetype, but an example of an actual spirit.
Do we know whether they ever shared any of their information with Teddy Roosevelt?
We don't. I've always been curious about that. I don't
Yeah.
think so, because it was later on in their lives that this opened up. And at first they were pretty quiet and private about it. In fact, he didn't even reveal that his wife was the medium until she had passed.
Oh.
Mhm.
So this book, was it published after she passed?
This was a huge breakthrough book, because what had happened was, when she passed, he thought that the experience he had at her passing was what all this work was meant to culminate in, because he was inundated with the feeling of her intimate presence, and it just supported him for the rest of his life. It never left him. But he resisted visiting a medium to communicate with her. He later admitted, for fear that the communication would be inferior and might shake this faith that he felt.
Mm.
But eventually he went to Joan and Darby, who wrote a famous book called Our Unseen Guest, another classic in spiritualism. And they were old friends. And she said, well, I know you don't want to try to get Betty, but why don't you let me talk to my guides, and maybe we can help guide you now. And he said, okay, but no Betty. Well, of course, Betty barged in instantly, started out by calling him Stute, which is a name she never used in public ever. And then he said, spent 2.5 hours giving him absolutely intimate details with 100% accuracy of their life together. So intimate that he was afraid that Joan might remember some of it and he would be embarrassed.
Wow, what a confirmation, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Did he continue to talk to Betty?
He did. He would always meditate in her blue room and get
Mm.
instructions from her. And he also got letters, hundreds of letters from people who had Betty experiences.
I'll have to look out that book. Book number 5. This is one that's going to challenge me. The Dark Red Amulet, Oral Instructions on the Practice of Vajrakalaya
Vajrakalaya. Yeah,
by Kenshin Porden Sharab
that is correct. Very good.
and Kenpo Shiwang Dongyul.
That is correct.
Oh,
Very nice. Yes, this is an unusual one. The Vajrakalaya tradition is the lightning tradition. It's this fast way to get to enlightenment. Very fascinating. And sometimes we see these depictions of wrathful deities. I saw them on Manly Hall had this wonderful Japanese altar in his office. He had a lot of beautiful Chinese carved furniture and just great stuff. And so he had a lot of these little wrathful figures and some other Yab Yum figures and such. And I always wondered about them. And he did explain to me, he said, well, they're protecting the Dharma. Their wrath is in defense of enlightenment, and they're attacking ignorance and trampling it underfoot. And I thought that was great. So this is one of the great scriptures, and was not available. I wish that he could have read it. It wasn't around when he was. I think he would have loved it, in which we get an actual ritual and an example of how Vajrakalaya is practiced. And I like this one because, in the West, we have this tradition where we think of evil and demons and such as being creatures that oppose God forever. It's until the end of time, there is this opposition. That's not the way that it's seen in Vajrakalaya. In Vajrakalaya, they're just beings that need to be enlightened like any other being. So what happens in Vajrakalaya is the practitioners, and you can hear this chant on YouTube, they start making loud noises and brash horns and clashing cymbals, and they attract the demons with these sounds, these chaotic loud sounds, and they call on the demons to come to them. And then they start this chant, which basically says, you demons, with the power of this wrathful deity, I'm about to liberate you, because it is your destiny to be enlightened, and there's no way you can avoid it, because inside yourself is the Buddha. So now you are frozen, and you must listen to me, and you have to listen to this chant until it enlightens you. Well, I just thought that was great. But beyond that side of it, it's also useful in dealing with our own shadows and with traumas and such and our subpersonalities, we can do the Vajrakalaya and we can summon these damaged parts of ourselves, traumatized parts of ourselves, and we can remind them that within them is the full enlightenment of the Buddha. And so they can become enlightened. It's a very reassuring and integrating kind of a process. But I recommend it for people, if you don't have a teacher, or to use it more in the sense of reading it and being inspired by it and using it for meditation than attempting the real, like I'm calling the demons practice. For your own meditation, for your own inner demons, absolutely. For the demons out there, you want a teacher to teach you the proper ritual.
Okay, well, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to a No BS Spiritual Book Club interview and sharing the 10 books that had the biggest influence on his life journey is writer, musician, documentary producer, author of books on mystical traditions, metaphysical countercultures, and Rosicrucian origins, Ronnie Pontiac. We'll be back with the rest of Ronnie Pontiac's 10 best list of spiritual books after this break. Stay tuned.
OMTimes TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting OMTimes Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit sedgbeer.com, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. OMTimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, OMTimes offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an OMTimes magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on OMTimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive OMTimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. OMTimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
I wanted to talk to you about a program called the Dream Arc and a retreat that we're doing, and I want to invite you along. And the Dream Arc is a dream technology. And even the latest physics is suggesting now that reality is not what we think it is, that it's kind of a construct. And that the Dream Arc teaches us how to use the full operating system to navigate our brain frequencies between waking and sleeping and dreaming, and to move through the inner realms and the outer realms seamlessly. And you will work in the Dream Arc with certain animals that will come to you, maybe in real life, maybe through your intuition, in magical ways, or perhaps through, just dreams that come to you. It's filled, the Dream Arc, with invitations and suggestions and tasks that you choose intuitively. You choose the ones for you. You don't know what you're choosing, but they come to you. So please join us as we dive down the wormhole into the Dream Arc, and let's see what happens.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Ronnie Pontiac, book 6 on your list is Plotinus on the Beautiful, being the 6th treatise of the first Ennead, literally translated by Stephen McKenna.
This is a beautiful translation of an absolutely beautiful talk that was given by Plotinus in ancient Rome. Plotinus was the mystical side of the Neoplatonic school, and he was famed for his eloquence. This is something that Manly Hall let me know about. And this is the Stephen McKenna translation, which is unusually lyrical. So what happens in this short piece that you could sit and read in an evening is a ladder, and we climb from the physical beauties of the world and the things that entrance us because they are beautiful because of their color or shape. And Plotinus takes us by the hand and leads us step by step up this ladder. He takes us and he says, well, what about the beauty of an action or of a thought? And then he leads us up even higher. And eventually he takes us all the way to the good, the true, and the beautiful, which is 3 ways of looking at one thing. And this, to me, it reads like a poem. It's just so beautiful and fluid. And it's a meditation that lifts you from a good thing, which is appreciation of the physical world, to be able to remind yourself about the birds singing and the flowers blooming and all the little humble things that can make life joyful on any given day. But then to see how each of those things points up to higher and higher levels until you recognize that those flowers and those birds singing are an expression of the good, the true, and the beautiful, of the divine.
So book number 7 is the Rulership book by Rex Beals, originally published in 1976. And this is often described as a dictionary for astrologers.
Yes, this was a book that I found out about from one of the librarians at PRS, because when I worked for Manly Hall, I did not believe in astrology when I first met him. And when he started to talk to me about it, I thought, wow, I had the nerve to say, really? Like, you believe in this stuff? You? He thought that was very funny. And he said, well, let me introduce you to a good astrologer so you can learn enough about it so we can debate. And he introduced me to this wonderful woman, Peggy, and she read my chart and blew my mind. And we never debated. And then all of the people that worked at PRS started to hand me these astrological books. Oh, you should read this one. Oh, this one's important. And this was one I got from a librarian named Alice. And this is a marvelous book that takes almost anything you can think of and categorizes it by planet or sign. And this is a fun read or meditation just to ponder how come all of these things fall under Saturn, for example. And it's very poetic, but it's also very useful for astrologers, obviously, in a couple of ways. One, you can have an unusual life event and then go to the rulership book and say, okay, what planet is involved here and what's happening in my chart with this planet? But you can also enrich your knowledge of the signs and the planets. And going back to Plotinus just for a moment, because he has this wonderful quotation that to me is the explanation of how astrology works. And I think that this book really exemplifies and is a good tool for what Plotinus describes here. So the quote goes, the stars are like letters that inscribe themselves at every moment in the sky. Everything in the world is full of signs. All events are coordinated. All things depend on each other. Everything breathes together. And when we read this rulership book, we see, wow, all these things connect in the most wonderful ways. And it can also help you in your metaphysical studies, because if you're looking into alchemy or into magical practices, you find these hints about what belongs to what in the world of correspondences.
Well, I searched for the book and it's not available. There were a couple of other rulership books. Have you come across those?
I believe that these are different editions. Is it not? I think that
Not by him.
not by him, really?
No, by other people.
Strange. Oh, I
Yeah.
thought for sure it was still available. I think you can find used copies. There were lots of books published. I know that. I am not familiar with the other rulership books. I'm sorry to say. I really have relied on this one.
Yeah. I wonder
I will
whether
check them out though.
I wondered whether the others were just copying because this one didn't seem to be available.
Yeah.
Okay, so book number 8, The Mystical Hymns of Orpheus, the invocations used in the Eleusinian Mysteries, translated by Thomas Taylor, and I think this was published in 1824.
Mhm. Well, this was something that I found thanks to Manly Hall. It was the last project that I worked on with him, was this a republication that PRS, his foundation, did of this book. And I was aware of the history of it, which is fascinating because it's something that has inspired so much art, opera, sculpture, and just it's had a huge influence on the Western esoteric tradition. It was described by Marsilio Ficino. These hymns were described as there's no more powerful magic than the Orphic hymns. And he said that the Orphic hymns taught him love, and that the key to magic is love. And Agrippa said that for people who are interested in magic, they should research these hymns. And if you practice them in the right way, that they were the most powerful magic that there is. So having some awareness of that, I wanted to explore it. And I knew that these hymns had inspired Shelley and Keats and William Blake and Ralph Waldo Emerson and just all sorts of people. And very difficult translation. The hymns in the original, in the ancient Greek, are difficult because they're kind of boring. They're repetitive, they're formulaic, because the priests who used them knew all the correspondences and details of each god and didn't need to include it. For us who don't know that stuff, it's a dry read. So Tamra and I went back. I studied some ancient Greek, and we went back to the ancient Greek, and then we added cult and symbols and things that were associated in ancient times with each of these gods or each of these matters of life. And the hymns themselves are they address every aspect of life, and they kind of greet and honor every aspect of life. Even death is addressed. And it isn't softened. It says, there's no way to get you to give us mercy. You're going to do what you have to do when fate decrees. But you can lead us away from the wheel of deep grief and take us to the fields of enlightenment. You can teach us to love life, because our time is limited, and those that we hold precious will not always be here. And so even death has these blessings, this wisdom, and has something to teach us. And the hymns are filled with that. So we tried to make them beautiful and singable. We didn't really rhyme too much, but to put them in a form where people could enjoy them as literature or poems, or they could practice them ritually. And so this is the book that started all that for us. And it's why we have a book out now called The Magic of the Orphic Hymns. And Thomas Taylor, just for a moment, was a fascinating character who translated Plato and the Neoplatonists and just volumes of this material. Mostly he was ridiculed by the people, the critics of his time, who thought it was ridiculous to spend your time on this pagan stuff. But he was a huge inspiration, as already pointed out, to arts and to poets and to metaphysicians. And his was the only translation for a very long time.
Well, this one, obviously, one cannot find this, but one can find a PDF that's free to download if you go and Google it. And the PDF, I actually did this yesterday, it looks like somebody's photographed every single page and then turned them into a PDF. Is your book, would one be better off reading your book? Will we learn as much? Will we understand more?
I think you might be better off starting with mine, maybe, unless you're already somebody that's deeply into that kind of material, because Thomas Taylor is famous for his tortured run-on sentences and syntax, and it can be fun, but it's difficult. And his footnotes that just go on forever, but often have brilliant insights or little bits of information that no one else has. So they're like the I Ching, I would say, maybe start with ours or with Athanasicus's translation, which is the academic translation, is wonderful. It has a lot of supporting information. And then add other translation, including Taylor's, and you get a sense of being able that way to kind of triangulate into what the Greek actually meant.
Good. Okay. Book number 9, God is Red, A Native View of Religion by Vine Deloria Jr., originally published in 1972. And this book is regarded as the seminal work on native religious views independent of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. This was a very important book that it really masquerades as a history of the terrible relationship between the colonists and the indigenous people in America. But in doing so, the author presents this wonderful contrast between Christianity and that heritage and indigenous heritage. And he shows us the difference, for example, in the way nature is perceived and treated. He reminds us that many of the early colonists were terrified of the American wilderness. They thought that the indigenous tribes were the devil's henchmen, and they really didn't have a sense of rapport with nature. They saw it more as a trap or a threat. Meanwhile, the indigenous people were living in tremendous harmony and respect with nature and found divinity and life in everything. Even rocks were considered to have spirits within them. And so this was a life that was filled with the spiritual presence that is very similar to what was described in the Unobstructed Universe books. But it was dismissed as the pathetic fallacy, right, by the West. It was like, this is just a childlike, idiotic way of looking at the world, that a rock has a soul in it. Well, now that we're going along in science and we're discovering that matter isn't anywhere near as solid as we thought it was, and we're seeing that there seems to be some evidence that consciousness and matter are connected in ways that are not as simple as our brain creates a froth of consciousness, then this other point of view suddenly becomes much more interesting, and I would say more necessary, because what we're facing in the world today is the result, unfortunately, of that viewpoint that is been taught for generations in the West, that nature is here to be exploited, that we throw our trash in our neighbor's yard, and this absolutely different point of view. If we could absorb some of this respect that indigenous people feel toward life and toward nature, we would be taking a long step forward in making the right choices to preserve some kind of a future for the generations that come after us.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, what a disaster that was. I mean, whoever believed that they could, import people with such a long religious tradition and let them loose in the West, where you've got something completely opposite that they would never understand.
Yeah, well, they thought it was manifest destiny, that they were the most ridiculous version of it. I write about it in my book, American Metaphysical Religion, was the Spanish when they came. They had like these mastiffs wearing armor, and their horses were wearing armor, and they would get in front of a tribe and read in Spanish that you are now subjects of the Spanish king. And meanwhile, they were spreading diseases that were killing thousands. It's just terribly ridiculous. And
yes. Yeah. And they called the indigenous people pagans.
They did.
Yeah.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So book number 10. Let's have a look at that one. The God of Ecstasy, Sex Roles and the Madness of Dionysus by Arthur Evans, published in 1988.
This is a marvelous little book, and Arthur Evans is an amazing writer. He also wrote a great book called Critique of Patriarchal Reason that kind of dismantles the whole idea that reason is the human greatest attainment of humans. He essentially argues in both of these books that we have taken perfectly legitimate other ways of relating to life outside reason, like intuition or many others. And we have have replaced them with this idea that only this works, and this is the only way that things can be legitimate. And he feels that this is absolutely wrong. And then he analyzes the lives of the philosophers who created this and reveals what a mess their lives were and what difficult times they had with gender and with all kinds of things in society that for them didn't seem to be right, and suggests that maybe this is slightly pathological, this idea of patriarchal reason. But this book was his first, and Arthur was a very early proponent of two liberation movements, gay rights in New York, and was part of the whole Stonewall world. And he was also a great proponent of pagan liberation. And he was the founder of a movement called the Radical Fairies in San Francisco, which was both gay rights and pagan. And this book is his look at the history of Dionysus, especially through the prism of this beautiful tragedy by Euripides, the Bacchae. And this is a look at, his argument essentially is that the Dionysian religion was this upsurge of female power and of blurred gender and of artistic freedom. And it was anti-war and pro-partying, basically. Wine, the wine god was at the center of it. And it was a shocking counterculture in a Greece that had worshipped warriors and where service to the state and being a man meant everything. Here we had women who were in positions of power as the maenads who controlled the mysteries, and suddenly women had their own privacy, and they would go out in the woods and have rituals, and men were not allowed to observe them at great risk. And the play by Euripides describes a mother who is driven mad by the god and kills her own son for spying on the mysteries that these women are doing in the forest. So as he writes this, he suggests that the witchcraft persecutions were actually the suppression of the remnants of pagan religion, that this was not the practices of the devil. This was the ancient religion of Dionysus, and that there were still women and men in the rural areas that wanted to practice this traditional religion. And it was viciously demonized by the church and crushed because they wanted to eliminate any competition. And then he does a translation of this Euripides play, which is quite beautiful. And he goes into great depth explaining to us what this play shows us, because the play is essentially about Dionysus coming to town in a town that is ruled by a very macho king. And Dionysus is this effeminate kind of guy who wanders in, and they're very offended by his presence, and they put him in jail. And they claim, you're not a god, you're just some pervert. And when they put him into jail, he warns this fellow, you're asking for a lot of trouble. The god will punish you. And sure enough, there's an earthquake that brings down the prison, and he walks out. And the king walks up to him and wants to know what the women are doing out there in the forest. And Dionysus says, well, why don't we dress you up as a woman? And then you can find out. And this big macho warrior gets dressed up as a woman and winds up worrying that he doesn't look cute enough in the outfit. And this feminine side comes out, but it has the tragic ending because his curiosity is rewarded by his own mother killing him for violating the mysteries. And this is Euripides' way of saying to us, we'd all like to live in the world of patriarchal reason where there's nothing irrational and we all know exactly what to do, but that's not the world. There's another side of the world. There's the female side of the world. There's the gender blurred side of the world. And it's filled with equally powerful and important wisdom. And if we ignore it, it comes back and it makes us do crazy, destructive things. And that would seem to be the history of the West.
Yes, for sure. For sure. Well, that's your 10 best list. Now let's talk a little bit about you. First of all, I want to know that, Manly P. Hall aside, if you could spend some time with any one of these authors, which one would you pick?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Wow, which one would I pick? I want to meet them all. It's funny. I mean, it's very hard for me to choose because I do love all of these authors, and I would love everyone I've talked about. It's super hard to pick, but I love Betty. For some reason, the unobstructed, just who she was, and Stuart and Betty, like, yeah, I would just love to sit with Stuart and Betty and just be in Betty's presence, because there was something about her that is so filled with love and light, and but all of them, I mean, it would be very difficult to choose. I will say that Socrates, when he was talking about he's about to take the poison, he was trying to comfort everyone, and he said, well, look, I mean, if I'm going to the afterlife, I'm going to get to meet like these incredible people, and the first person he mentioned was Orpheus.
Yeah, I think I'd choose Betty too. I mean, any woman, I mean, the way you described Stuart, any woman who could change that man's, direction and outlook on life must be pretty amazing.
She had an amazing way with plants and animals that he writes about at length. So very briefly, she collected exotic seeds, and a lot of the exotic plant life around Santa Barbara, including the bird of paradise plants, were brought by her from other
Wow.
places. And they had a beautiful garden filled with these rare plants that she'd acquired that were all flourishing. And when Betty passed, they all began to die. And Stuart had resources, so he hired the best horticulturalists he could find, several people, and brought them out to save Betty's garden. No, without Betty, the garden didn't want to live. And he also said that with animals, that she had this incredible way that they loved to camp together. And he said, I don't know how many times I've seen her. He said, for instance, once she was wading in a stream and we turned a corner and there was a bear who was hustling right toward us. And he said, I was looking for my gun to protect her, terrified for her. And she stood there, all 4'11" of her. And she pointed at that bear and she said, bad bear, no. And the bear stopped. He said, now you go away like a good bear. And the bear turned around and walked away, and with an aw shucks kind of thing. And he said, I often found her when I came back from a trail sitting with a raven a foot away from her who was squawking at her, and they were talking. Or he told a story about seeing a lion in a zoo, and they stood and they watched this poor lion, and then Betty finally sighed and she walked away, and the lion stood up and he walked over to the edge of the cage and he stared at Betty until he couldn't see her. And Stuart watched this and he said, what did you do to that cat? And she said, I sent him pictures of the Serengeti, the poor thing. So yeah. I just love her. She seems to me to be one of the great female spiritual teachers of all time, and so little known.
Yes. Well, you're a cat butler. I mean, do you do things like that with your cats?
Well, cats, I mean, to me, cats are, they're like this, they're equals. They're not pets. They're beyond equals, actually. Every cat seems to think that it is the incarnate deity of the planet. Yes. And I love that about cats. And so my job is to individualize every cat that I come into contact with by trying to understand every aspect of their needs and knowing when to open up the world for them a little more and all that kind of thing. Over the years, I've gotten pretty good at it. And it's funny because Betty talks about this, and she was asked, do pets survive? Like, do we have pets in the unobstructed? And she said, you know, anything that individuates, that the individual is immortal. And she said, so, you know, an individual amoeba, probably not. It probably returns to the collective consciousness of the amoeba. But if you've got a cat who has a sense of self and who is able to manipulate you rationally when they're hungry and such, that being is on the trail, on the path, and they will be rising and rising until they'll become the greatest cat they can possibly be, filled with all the consciousness and a cat can have. And then they will graduate to something else because they're too big to be a cat. And just like us, we just all the way up the ladder. So I see cats as these wonderful to me, they're my favorite invention on this planet. Like, I don't know who was in charge of cats, but think of all the joy, cats and dogs, that these animals bring to people, all the lessons they teach, and they're just wonderful. So yes, I'm there trying to help these little incarnate gods have the most paradise-like existence they can have.
Well, that's lovely. I mean, cats, I think, are, they're the epitome of entitlement,
Yes.
and if we can learn anything from them, it's confidence,
Yeah.
because that is what they exude,
Yeah.
absolute confidence.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're just so darn human.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, they're amazing. I mean, the communication,
Yes.
it's downright weird. I mean, I think they're evolving before our eyes. And I have a cat, for example, who literally says her name and articulates it very well. And then the funny thing is, her brother learned to say her name because we made such a big deal out of her saying her name that he was like, "Hey, I can say it too." So, and I'm sure you've seen also videos of cats that seem to be articulating sentences and such.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
wild. I had a friend when I was a kid, when I first got to PRS, who told me that she once got up in the middle of the night, walked into the kitchen of her friend's house where she was staying, and a cat talked to her for a moment. I
Yeah.
didn't believe it, but now I'm not so sure now.
Yeah, I know people who talk to their cats and their dogs. Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah,
and teach others how to do it too.
yeah.
We've only got a few minutes left, so tell us
Okay.
about your next book. And I believe this is the one on Rosicrucianism, is it?
Yes, this is a new vision. The first three books, so the American Metaphysical Religion book, the Magic of the Orphic Hymns, which I co-wrote with Tamra, and this book on Rosicrucianism in context, are really three books in a series of examinations of counterculture in Western Esotericism. And one of the great countercultures was Rosicrucianism. But there's so much misinformation about it. People have just outright invented things, and there's so many different ideas about who did this, who wrote the Rosicrucian manifestos, who created this mania
Mm.
that suddenly hit Europe. It seems to be, from all this wonderful new research that has come out, that it's less invisible masters and that kind of thing, and more something that resembles the beatniks, in a sense, in that we have college students who have kind of radical professors who are reading these radical writers like Giordano Bruno and Boethius, and they're inculcating these kids with these ideas. We got to get rid of the Pope, and we got to love science, and we've got to open up a personal relationship with the divine, as Protestantism teaches, and we've got to inspire the arts, and it's just a completely different view of the world than what the Catholic Church was pushing at that time. And this book seems to have been written by one or a group of young students who were partially kidding around. I mean, it does have esoteric knowledge, and it's very much a revolutionary tract, the Fama. And yet, at the same time, there's humor in it, if you understand where these things are coming from. And they seem to have been taken by surprise by the reaction. They were trying to poke at the Pope, trying to encourage the emperor to be a philosopher king and fight the power of the Catholic Church. But they were also kind of making fun of the existing society. And they didn't think, they shared it with some friends, and all of a sudden it was this giant controversy with hundreds of books being published. And this was fascinating to me, that this was done by young people who had a sense of revolution and who were swept away in this idea that, wow, it's about to happen. The whole world's going to wake up. It reminded me so much of things that friends that I had who had been active in the 1960s told me about that era. And we usually don't think of the Rosicrucians that way, but
No, not at all.
that seems to be what was going on. So this book is trying to take all this new research and show us what happened. And we actually see these authors retract. They step back from it because it's all wrong. Even the people who support them are saying, I want to be a Rosicrucian. And the message was, if you want a universal reformation, you got to start in your own little corner of the world. Start with you and start with those around you. You're not going to join the secret order of invisibles, and all the metaphors were taken literally. And yeah, it's an interesting study.
When did it emerge? Was it the 1600s or
Yeah,
later?
this is in the early 1600s,
That's
and
quite revolutionary for that time.
oh, very much so, yes. And
Yeah.
it also involves so much science because part of what my book is about is the political context. Because a lot of these hopes rose around two rulers. Emperor Rudolph II, who loved Hermeticism and the occult, and he collected Bosch's art, and he was really a character. And they hoped that he would rise up as this king, who would block all the philosopher king who would block the Catholic Church. But he didn't want any trouble. He just wanted to have his collections and enjoy his life. And then the other one was this very young man, Frederick Palatin, who was somebody whose family went back to like one of Charlemagne's generals. And he was married to Princess Elizabeth of England, the daughter of James. And everybody thought this is it, because this is a very high German prince who believes in breaking the stranglehold of the Catholic Church on Europe, and who's all into esotericism and Shakespeare and Orpheus, and then here is the daughter named after Queen Elizabeth I of James. Clearly, Europe's going to go to war now against the Catholics, but James wasn't willing to go to war, and neither were the German princes. So the result was the absolute collapse of Frederick and Elizabeth's world and the beginning of the 30 Years' War. But there was a brief moment there where all the talent in Europe, all the artists, all the free thinkers were in this fever of expectation that there was going to be this beautiful awakening.
Yes, well, that seems to come around and around and around, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah,
It's a
very much
beautiful
so.
awakening that we're all waiting for.
Yeah.
Ronnie, we're out of time now, unfortunately. I want to thank you for adding your 10 best list of spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. Also, can you tell our viewers where they can find out more about you and your work?
Sure. If you want to reach me, at the Ronnie Pontiac on Instagram.
Okay.
I am also Ronnie Pontiac on Facebook. I do not have my own website, but if you Google or use whatever search engine you prefer my name, you will find films that I worked on, music, and all kinds of writing, both online and off. And also, if you look into Tamra Lucid's work, because her work overlaps with mine, you will find a lot of my stuff.
Okay. And you can also find Ronnie's 10 best list and his written descriptions on the No BS Spiritual Book Club website. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you to Ronnie Pontiac.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to speak with you and be on this broadcast.
Thank you, Ronnie.